Thank you, Frank Godfrey, for joining us here today. We are going to go ahead and get launched, and I'm going to turn it over to you. And I'll ask other folks to mute their phones, and then we can either use the chat or the raised hands if you have questions. And I think, Frank, you're okay with them having questions along the way, and I can just monitor the PowerPoint and the chat and let you know if there are questions that are coming up.
Yeah, perfect. That's perfect.
All right. You are on. Right. I think I'm just going to ask Brad, I know you're on. Can you see the screen? The slides?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, perfect.
And also one other thing, Frank, just so you know, this is being recorded. And it will get posted on the chamber website afterwards.
Okay,
so
okay,
so
perfect,
people,
Brad.
so people can see it, you know, that maybe can't tune in live, but at least they can use it as a reference in a future point. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Understood. So we
Excellent.
ready to go?
We are ready to go. Everybody can see the screen. The slides are up.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Frank Godfrey, and I'm one of the partners at the law firm of Moomaw, Mesirow Godfrey. And just so you know a little bit about my particular background, I am a partner at the law firm, and I do trial work for our business clients. So I manage the trial and litigation practice, and I also advise our clients on employment related matters. So a lot of my trial work can involve defending clients on, you know, employment related claims, and a large chunk of my practice is devoted to advising clients so on employment matters. And as you can imagine, this COVID-19 pandemic has had an impact on businesses across the world, and as it relates to, you know, our practice, it has been interesting to see the different types of impacts that have descended on business owners. And it really depends on what kind of business you have. We have clients who are, think of them as environmental cleanup type folks, and they were on the front line of the COVID-19 pandemic when it comes to workplace issues. So that was the first experience I had in actually advising clients on employment matters. And it predated the programs that came out of Congress and all the local and state programs that have emerged to try and help businesses navigate through these business issues. So what I want to tell you before I start, that's just a little background to give you an idea of, you know, what I do and how I've been dealing with these issues on behalf of my clients. I have a philosophy where I have a presentation that's prepared for you, but if you have specific questions for me at any time, I certainly would like you to ask, and I want to make sure that we're able to impart as much value to folks as we can in the short time we have this morning. I'll tell you this, it's been interesting in that sometimes there are answers and sometimes there are not answers to questions we're getting. But what I can tell you is that, you know, the safest course to navigate any of these related issues in the workplace when it comes to your employees is, you know, to be patient, to be reasonable, to be flexible, and to make a decision, you know, on that basis. Employment laws are still in effect. Employees have protections, and now they're getting additional protections. On the other hand, given the gravity and the global extent of COVID-19 and, the government's involvement in trying to help sustain employees and employers during this pandemic, I think that employers, in the legal front at least, are going to have a lot of grace and, are going to be treated a little differently in terms of liability. Now, you should still be careful as you're navigating through these issues, obviously, but I do think that there's going to be a recognition that we're all in this together, and as long as we're trying to make reasonable business decisions, business decisions that we can support with facts, that will be okay in the long run. And so, that's how I approach advising my clients, because in my experience, and particularly in my trial experience prior to this pandemic, that kind of behavior is always very helpful when clients find themselves in an actual legal dispute. So if we can take a look at the presentation outline, I'm sure everyone's aware of the programs that are available to support businesses and employees. These include the Family First Coronavirus Relief Act, the Payroll Protection Program, tax deferrals. Reopening your businesses, I know that is a big concern for people. So I'm happy to talk with folks specifically about, what concerns they may have regarding customer-client concerns, employee concerns, talk to you about maybe best practices or recommendations for ongoing business concerns. I know in my experience right now, I've seen everything from very substantial layoffs to partial reductions in force to brick and mortar type businesses continuing to operate pretty much fully staffed, but in a new manner, and oftentimes almost entirely remotely. So a lot of the issues are going to be very specific to, your type of business. And at my firm, we have clients in all manner of business, just for your information, and everything from maybe a sole proprietor to a manufacturing employer with close to 200 employees. So I've been dealing with a lot of different issues in a lot of different contexts. So I hope that is helpful. So I know a lot of folks have been asking about the paid time off, how it's going to affect their business, how it's going to overlap with, say, the Family Medical Leave Act, how it's going to overlap with Oregon's, paid sick time, Oregon's Family Leave Act, how it's going to impact your specific business, what the employees, in terms of expectations, what are those going to be, when they return to work. So that's very broad ranging. And if people have specific questions, I'm happy to answer about that. It's very interesting. I think a lot of employees say, employees who have been laid off, I think you're going to have some different types of expectations and maybe some education is going to be required, because people who have been laid off may not necessarily be eligible for some of this leave. The people who have continued to work will be. They'll be, the leave will be, divided into different categories. There's a large component that's going to deal with child care and these types of issues. So what you're really going to face is a case-by-case analysis when you bring your employees back, or as you navigate through the issues right now. I'll tell you, for the moment, I think I have not gotten a lot of questions from my clients about people taking off, people who are working right now wanting to take off, those kinds of things. I think most people who are still working are happy to be working, and unless they're sick or there's a real issue they can't accommodate, that that hasn't really raised its head in the workplace yet. So, but I'm sure that's coming. And I think another big challenge is that the federal legislation that applies to employers with less than 500 employees, it seems daunting for folks who employ, fewer than 50 people. If you've employed more than 50 people, or if you do, you're probably more familiar with the federal regulations and how they can overlap with the state regulations, and how that can then impact how you're administering your own paid time off programs and so forth. So it's so specific that, I think in general, what folks ought to do is just familiarize themselves. The EEOC has been updating its site for employers' use on, different types of issues that are going to crop up, and, some best practices for employers to follow. I also think I'm telling all my clients that it's important to monitor your local health authority, your local government orders, the CDC, depending on what industry you're in, be very cognizant of OSHA rules and regulations, and just, try to keep up with these things, try to be reasonable. And if you have questions, it's okay to reach out to your attorney and ask. I can tell you a lot of times counsel may not have, a black and white answer for you. So there's a lot of gray. And I don't think I started off, and I should have, by saying what I'm doing today is just providing general, general presentation. I'm not providing anybody with specific legal advice. I really want this, and hopefully it can be, an educational process, and just an opportunity for people to ask questions about what it's going to look like when I reopen my business, and how I'm going to have to navigate this. I want to stop here and just tell you that I have a background in dealing with a lot of ADA issues, and I think this will provide some value to people today. The ADA and the Department of Labor has already started to talk about how this COVID-19 is going to impact ADA-related matters in the workplace. And it's going to be interesting, because I think what you're also going to see is people coming back to work anxious. Some of them will be afraid. Some people will have pre-existing, you may not know about it, anxiety disorders, maybe other, types of mental health issues that have been exacerbated by this pandemic. So I would anticipate that's going to be a big issue for people to address with their employees. And the reason I want to bring this up is because it can be, the ADA can be an intimidating law for employers to cope with. But I think there's a lot of guidance that can help employers, particularly at this time, because, you know, if you really distill the ADA down to its essence, what you'll come down to is, you know, the determination of whether an employer and an employee with limitations can continue the relationship will be based on a good faith conversation called the interactive process. And it can be intimidating, and sometimes it can be difficult to manage depending on the severity of the health issue. But sometimes it just boils down to a simple conversation about, you know, what the person needs to continue in their job and what the employer can do to help them do that. Just a simple conversation. I think a lot of these issues that we're going to deal with employees when we come back, and I say we because I'm in the same boat. I'm dealing with issues at my firm with my own employees. It's just going to be conversational. You're going to have to talk to people, you know, ask them why they're anxious. Is there a reason that they don't want to do a certain assignment? Is there a reason they want to continue to work remotely? See if their fear has any basis in reason. Talk to them. You know, I think under the circumstances, unless it's having a dramatic impact on your business operations, and that may certainly occur, the better course for the time being is to be a little more flexible than you normally would. So I think childcare is going to be a huge issue for people when businesses come back to some resemblance of normal, whatever that's going to look like. I don't know what the regulations are going to be for childcare providers. I know some people are operating under temporary emergency licensing. You know, the number of children they can take in is reduced dramatically. Many are simply dedicated to taking care of the first responders. But that's certainly going to be an issue when you reopen and folks come back to work, because it doesn't look like school is going to reopen. Does look like there's going to be some disruption to summer activities where children are usually placed, camps, these types of things. So, you know, we can expect those kinds of disruptions to occur into the future, into next year. I would imagine some folks have been working with the Paycheck Protection Program. I don't know the extent to which this group has done that, but it is it appears to be a good program. It looks like, you know, Congress is going to provide additional funds, so that should help, hopefully, knock on wood, quite a few businesses. And so I have noticed that, I'll just make this observation. I don't know if anybody has gone through this, but you know, some folks who were doing reductions in force or layoffs did so early on in the crisis as it was building, this is from my own personal experience. Some were required by necessity because maybe they had a lot of clients in Europe, and because Europe was ahead of us and slowing down prior to us. And if you were in a certain industry, it almost came to a grinding halt. But, you know, what they had done was reduced almost half the staff and then reduced hours of the remaining folks, had reclassified people to hourly, limited the hours. But it's going to have an impact on what funds are available to them from the Paycheck Protection Program. And that's another good example of in this type of crisis, this type of environment, a lot of times you're going to find yourself in a situation where you'll be operating in a lot of gray. You won't have clear answers, and you've just got to make your best business decision, and you'll just have to live with it. But there's a lot of rules and regulations out there. So I would advise people, you know, as you're navigating through this, particularly with the finances and those types of issues, CPAs are good sources of information. And then, you know, a lot of this is employment law related. So if you have an a law attorney, good to consult with them. Business attorneys, my firm does business advising. We're a business law firm. So my partner has been doing a lot of work with clients on SBA loans, financing issues. So folks are in the business community are looking at things a little differently right now, considering Workshare or, again, all the options that are out there. All these programs are rule-driven, so it's a good idea to really study the program rules to see if it's going to work for your business, if it's the right fit. So, and you know, here I am talking, and I haven't asked anybody to turn the slides. I'm on the phone here, so I apologize.
Frank, sorry about that. I was just going to jump in and ask you if I'm supposed to be on one of these slides.
I'm at the Workshare slide now, which is, let's see, I think it's number 5.
Workshare, there we are. Got it.
Yeah. So it's a good program. It's in conjunction with the unemployment department. You know, you can use it to continue your employees working at reduced hours. It's got some specific plan requirements that are on the slide, on the next slide. Is anybody utilizing Workshare right now? No?
If you're using Workshare, just you can be sure to jump in and just unmute yourself and respond if you'd like.
All right. Well, why don't we jump? You can review that on your own time. The requirements for Workshare on the slide. But let's go to the next slide, and I think people are maybe primarily interested in, you know, what's going to happen when we reopen. So here's what I can tell you, okay? The considerations are going to be specific to what the business actually has done. So as I said at the beginning of my presentation, you know, you may have a business that is like a restaurant, shuttered, not even doing takeout, okay? You may have a business that is partially open. You may have a business that is open but now operating almost entirely remotely, okay? So people are going to want to know, you know, what's going to happen and specific to their situation. So, you know, if you have reduced your force, furloughed people, laid them off, the main thing that you have to remember is what you told them to begin with, okay? So I'll give you an example of a force reduction I was involved in and what the employer told the employees. They said the following: this is an unprecedented financial crisis, and we never thought we'd face this. But we're facing it, and it's pretty bad, and we're trying to save the company. And as a result, we're going to reduce the staff by 50%. And we're going to tell you why we're keeping the people that we are. We're going to tell you about the process we went through to make the determination. And basically it was folks who could perform the duties of one or two other people. We looked at skills. And that's how we made our decision. And while we'd like to promise you an opportunity to return, we hope that happens, but we can't make any promises because we don't know what the business, much less our business community and our industry, is going to look like when we come out of this. So that's pretty straightforward, but it's important because if you've made promises to employees that when this is all over, you come back, and then you determine that you were ambitious and well-meaning, but that you were mistaken and that you can't bring them back for financial reasons, you're just going to have to be, you know, upfront and just tell them why. But if you have made promises to employees, keep that in mind when you're talking about bringing your employees back. When you come back, and again, it just depends on your type of industry. Are you in retail? Do you have a lot of clients or customers that frequent your office? If you do, or the more employees you have, the more concerns you'll have about, you know, what people may perceive as a lack of social distancing. So what I'm saying is we have to take our employees' health concerns seriously. I'm not implying that anybody does not pre-COVID-19. I'm simply saying there's going to be a greater emphasis on health concerns when we come out of this slowdown. So it's going to be important to be patient with our employees when they head back to work. And I'll say I do believe that we're going to have some PTSD related issues that manifest across industries, and it won't matter whether you have a handful of employees or over 100 employees. This pandemic has been...
Jones and Ross, I got the message from Butch Price. He wanted me to reach out to you and see what we're doing on the tax returns for the grant.
Hello? Are we there?
Yes, you are. I think we just had some background noise.
Yes, yes.
Took care of that.
Okay,
Sorry about that.
perfect. No, that's okay. That's okay. I know the people at Jones and Roth are involved in this too. So, yeah, it's just patience. Be reasonable, be flexible. People are concerned and fearful. You know, listen, make sure that their fears are grounded in reality. But even if they're not, you may decide it's a better course to be more flexible now than you were prior pandemic. And particularly, it's important if people are anxious or talking to us about not wanting to come back to work, to listen to see if there could be an ADA issue, okay? Because I can tell you, somebody who has respiratory issues, say someone who is asthmatic, you know, they may have legitimate concerns about coming back, and it may be that you are presented with an ADA type issue, and it may be that, you know, the interactive process of trying to figure out how you're going to accommodate, whether you have to accommodate the employee and how you do it is going to be a little different because of the pandemic. And frankly, you know, it may be a temporary matter, because once we achieve immunization, it may all disappear, okay? And there may be, I'm sure, a readjustment of legal requirements. But as we stand now, I fully expect people to encounter ADA issues. And if you do, and whenever you're talking to somebody, your employees, about medical issues, and a lot of the conversation, because of the nature of the crisis, are going to be medical right now, you know, be very careful, because if people disclose medical conditions to you, you know, you have to treat it confidentially. And that regards whether it's going to impact on the ADA or not. So keep that in mind as we go through this. As a practical matter, with the reopening of your business, I think, like anybody else who's following the news and following guidelines and following, you know, different agencies as they issue more and more temporary rules, and we've all heard this, it's the new normal. It's going to be a hybrid of where we are right now with a shutdown and what we look like partially reopening without immunization and a vaccination. So I think what we're going to see, and particularly here based on what I heard the governor saying and what I see other governors with similar approaches to Oregon's doing, is it's going to be gradual. We're going to have to maintain social distancing guidelines. You're going to be encouraged to continue to allow people to work remotely when possible. You're going to have to be more aware of people's health conditions if you are returning folks to a facility. It may be that certain aspects of your operation can't operate remotely because you have an assembly line, okay? But you have to do your best to adjust and maintain whatever you've done in the interim to comply with the social distancing guidelines. You know, you're going to have to really ramp up and, you know, talk about hygiene, cleanliness, minimum on a weekly basis. It may be that you're going to have folks wearing masks, face coverings. People may be reluctant to do that. I would rely on my management team my supervisors to set a good example with all these issues, particularly if you're reopening and some of these practices haven't been phased in over the last several weeks. You have to be aware that, you know, your delivery folks, your vendors, everybody's going through this transition. So, you know, just keep in mind all of these types of issues. And I think one of the silver linings to come out of this is that we may realize that there's more ability for telecommuting and remote work than we thought. And that, you know, spacing in the office and social distancing isn't as big of an obstacle to returning and becoming productive. Maybe
Frank,
that
do
we
you
have
time for
to.
a question?
Absolutely.
Do you foresee anything where working from home is becoming a reasonable accommodation such that employers have to facilitate the equipment for a home office, pay for internet, monitor setup and what have you? I feel like we're in this weird time where, you know, in the early 2000s, you would run into people who would negotiate having their DSL paid for. And then a little later on, it got so common that fell away. Then it was kind of the cell phone. Then it got so common and that fell away. And
Yeah.
I feel like we're seeing employers now just saying work from home, but some employees are not set up for it and they have not been equipped to do it. So is this going to stray into not just a reasonable accommodation, but a accommodation that requires cash outlays?
That's a great question. And I think the answer is yes. But I think that could be temporary. And you know, it's going to be case by case. But indeed, if you have a situation where it's really an ADA situation, yeah, part of that analysis and of reasonable accommodation, you know, may lead you to, I have to make this investment in equipment to keep this person productive. Now, the flip side of that is, as I said before, you know, it could just be temporary. If we get a vaccine in a year, you know, this may all sort of resolve itself. But for the moment, yeah. And there's been a lot of activity by, I think it's the Department of Labor, on addressing those specific types of ADA issues. So it's a great question. It's a great question. And you know, the way I look at it is, I look at it as an ADA compliance issue. I want to document what we're doing, want to be very reasonable, want to make sure that I understand fully what the costs are, and if it does indeed present an undue hardship to my business such that I don't think I can make the accommodation, I want to have good reasons why I can't do that. And that's why I said earlier, you know, that's a hard defense for many employers to rely on, the undue burden defense. In this situation, I don't think it'll be as difficult a burden, if that makes sense. But, you know, I think you're going to have ADA compliance in your analysis, and then I think you're going to have just, you know, a business analysis. Does making this accommodation, you know, make sense return-wise? And part of that's going to be looking bigger picture. Is a lot of my work moving out of this pandemic, even after we get a vaccination, going to be remote work anyway? So maybe I'm investing in the future. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah, it does. Odd time. There's some back and forth going on here on the board here about some companies having policies in place that were there already about, you cannot access company information on your own computer, et cetera. And so the flexibility and the willingness of the business entity is really going to be important to navigate something that doesn't have crisp rules.
Absolutely. 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 And some of the decisions, and some of the considerations are going to be counterintuitive. And by that, I mean, here's an example. Normally, who would have ever thought that the EEOC would say, hey, when you reopen, or if you're open now, you can actually require your employee to have their temperature taken before they come back, right? I mean, that was unheard of just a few weeks ago. So it's a time of a lot of gray and a lot of uncertainty. So, but I think people are going to have to just revisit their policies. Normally I always advise people, be careful about deviating from your policy, because if you deviate from your policy, you could set a precedent that will apply to all of your employees. And the easy example is, your policy is, I don't pay my employees at time of termination for their unused PTO balance. But I have an employee I really like. They've been loyal, great employee. I want to do something nice for them. I don't do severance. I'm gonna cash out that week of unused PTO. And somebody in the workforce hears about it 6 months later. You don't do the same for them, and then they sue you, and you're looking at wage and hour liability. Okay. Well, in this situation, it's a little different, because you may have your PTO policy. This person may have exhausted PTO. They may have exhausted family leave, and they may be looking at you in June saying, I don't know what to do. I don't have childcare. Everything's all out of whack. What can I do? What can I do? You may just decide in the moment, because this person does have an important function at your business, that you just have to make your own internal kind of accommodation and grant unpaid leave where you normally wouldn't. I can tell you, in this kind of pandemic situation we're in, I think, is there risk for the employer in deviating from their policy? Yeah. Is it the same kind of risk as it was pre-pandemic? Absolutely not. So that's why I go back to be reasonable, be objective, have really good reasons as to why you're making certain business decisions, document the decisions, and, just do your best. But I've already dealt with situations where we have employees who are afraid to work, and granted, in some of these situations, it's rather high risk work, but we need the bodies. And, you may have people on unpaid leave for a while, and then after a week or so of talking to them, trying to be reasonable with them, you may have to tell them, look, I'll put you on I'll temporarily lay you off, hope I can bring you back. I have to have somebody, on the workforce to go do this job, but you have to understand, I can't promise that I'm going to bring you back. And then you just have to live with that business decision. So, it's case by case, and it's industry by industry. So I think one of the silver line, and the CDC is changing its guidelines. OSHA is posting and trying to work through their COVID related guidelines. You can imagine what kind of an impact it's having on big construction projects, trying to actually social distance on a big municipal project, where you have people from different trades coming in at different times. Look, in the normal construction world, scheduling is a huge component, and right now it's really It's really a problem out there. Some projects are doing better than others, but everybody's in the same boat in making these decisions and accommodations and just trying to do their best.
So we have a question on the chat. Can I jump in?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so the question is, can you discuss employers' right to call back an employee now who's on temporary furlough for 6 to 8 hours per week to not impact the unemployment benefits? What if that employee declines because unemployment is financially sufficient for them right now? So unemployment's paying better than the job. Can you force the employee to come back?
Yeah, we're dealing with that. You know, what you want to do in that situation is try and reason with the person about coming back. And then, you know, if they don't want to come back, listen to why they don't want to come back. If it's simply because, hey, I'm making more on unemployment than I was when I was employed, I'm a lot more comfortable with telling a person in that position, look, you know, I need you to come back. And if you don't, I can't promise you I'm going to protect your job because I'm going to find somebody who will do the work. I'm trying to save my business. I'm trying to keep it running. So I'd have a lot less heartburn about, you know, telling somebody that as opposed to somebody who's telling me, I'd love to come back, but I, you know, have this health issue. Child care is a bear. My parents are ill, and so I'm taking care of my elderly parents. You can imagine it could be a lot of different reasons, pandemic related, they don't want to come back. So, but in your example, somebody just saying, hey, I'm making more money sitting on the sidelines, I don't want to come back. I'd try and reason with them, and then I'd let them know, you know, I can't guarantee that there's going to be a position for you if you don't come back, because I'm going to have to go hire somebody to do this work temporarily. So, you know, I can tell you I dealt with that issue a few weeks ago. It was up in Washington, and it resolved itself through a conversation like that. Person did come back to work, but that's what they, you know, they just were candid with us and said that. So that's the approach we took. So we didn't have to terminate them or, you know, let them sit on the sidelines and then terminate them later. So.
Great, thank you. I think there was a follow-up question. If employees have medical issues, which you might have addressed, that are a safety concern to them, do we have to bring them back? So.
Okay, that gets really difficult, and I'm going to give you, like I'm doing with all of this, that's general advice. Everything's very specific. Don't make any decisions based on what I'm telling you. Talk to your attorney, okay? But I can tell you this, a person with a medical condition, you really need to be careful on what decision you make, because that could very well impact the ADA, it could impact OFLA, it could impact FEMLA, depending on how many employees you have. So I need to know a lot more specific facts before I could give any kind of, you know, thoughts on that. But I can tell you that's a particularly challenging one. So be careful if that comes up. So, but again, what you need to do is have a conversation with the employee and try and get to the bottom of, you know, is it rational for them to say, I can't come back because of this medical issue? You may get in a situation where it is ADA and you do get into the whole requesting, you know, some information from the doctor about the request for an accommodation. It just depends. It just depends. So, but tread carefully.
So we have about 10 more minutes. I would encourage folks on the call, if they have other questions, to put those up in the chat or unmute yourself and ask so you get your questions answered. Thank you.
Frank, this is Brad Smith. I got a quick question for you. How would you handle an employee that maybe isn't taking things as seriously? You know, if say you wanted to have your employees wear masks and one is against that or says, you know, this doesn't work, can you require stuff that's above and beyond what you would normally require?
Yeah, you know, you can. And I think it's important to communicate with the employees when you're bringing them back, to let them know that what they left and what they're coming back to is going to look differently. Conversely, maybe they were working during a transition time and they saw some new practices, masks, hygiene, you know, social distancing in the office before the governor's order to stay home was issued. So again, that depends. But yeah, you know, people need to know it's serious. It's how the business is going to operate. Again, if you have somebody who is really resisting, I would treat it like any kind of, you know, employee counseling issue. I'd sit down, I'd talk with them, I'd try and figure out if they're just goofing off or if they have a serious concern. You know, Brad, maybe it is that they don't want to wear the mask or they don't want to do this. They don't, you know, they're kind of making fun of the social distancing because they're really anxious and afraid and they don't want to say it. So you may discover that during the conversation. But if it's somebody who's just, you know, doesn't want to follow the policy, well, then you just have to treat them like any other employee doesn't want to treat the policy, and let them know it's for the company's benefit, it's for their benefit, it's for all the employees' benefit, and it's simply not an option, you know. It's like somebody who's not following the social distancing guidelines that you have in place. At some point, you know, you may have to send them home without pay, or take whatever other disciplinary action that your policy allows you to take. So, does that make sense, Brad?
Yeah, very much so. Thanks.
Okay. Well, you know, I think another silver lining of sorts that may come out of this is that, you know, businesses are going to be able to rethink how they do business. Maybe people will have an opportunity to reduce the physical footprint, have a smaller office. Maybe, you know, frankly, you've laid some people off and, you know, you found out that you have more productive folks on your team now and you can do more with less. So there will be some silver linings that come out of this.
Another question.
Yeah.
Is someone, if someone is paid reduced wages now during April because of a sales drop, if the PPP funding is approved, any idea if you can make up with PPP funds back wages not fully paid? Assume salaried position and full salary was used in computations to PPP wage benefit.
That I don't know.
Okay. And John, if I didn't get that correctly, you can certainly chime in and correct it for me. We have another question. If you're forced to lay off 50% of your employees, we will keep the people who could perform the job duties of 1 or 2 people. So what are the best practices for redefining the job duties of those we have retained?
Yeah, well, you need to get with your HR and you know, if it's 50% reduction and you're doing you know, reduced amount of work, but you're doing more with less employees, and you really have to go look position by position and be careful about, you know, to make sure that this description fits the actual job duties. And because we were talking about the ADA, look, I'll tell you, if you have job descriptions, you want to make sure that you have the essential functions of the position, sort of the essence of what that job position is. If you have somebody doing 2 or 3 other person's positions, make sure that the restructured job description includes all the essential duties of that reconstructed position, particularly in this time, because we've been talking about ADA type issues. And so here's a bit of a bonus for everybody in this presentation. Job descriptions are critical, okay? And they're critical in ADA type issues and analyses and disputes. I can tell you, you won't really be able to figure out whether an accommodation is reasonable or not unless you have a good job description and you understand what the essential tasks of that position are, you know, because that's really what you're trying to build around in the accommodation. I can also tell you something as basic as attendance. I've had this happen in a trial. You know, it's common sense for most of us that, you know, if you work on a factory line on the second shift, you have to be there, let's say, you know, 3 to 11. You don't have that in the job description. You get into an issue. I had this happen where the judge got hung up on, well, if it was so important to be there at that particular shift between that particular time, should have had it on the job description. So that's an idea how important these things are. So that's a great question. And also look at your policies. You know, see if you have to do your own temporary personnel policies as you go through this COVID-19. Maybe that you have to make some accommodations. You may want to make accommodations in your policies and characterize them as temporary and to be revisited once we get through this crisis, which we will. And you want to communicate that to the employees. I think what's very important and what's very basic, but what gets a lot of people in trouble is communication. If you're bringing people back on, make sure you communicate to them what it's going to look like, why you're doing what you're doing. And I'll tell you, if you're bringing people back from a furlough, a reduction in force, a layoff, whatever you may have characterized it as, you know, be sure that you have good business reasons to bring back certain people and not others, because you're going to have folks who are not brought back on. They may think that there was a job protection in place and that they weren't brought back because of some sort of protected status, okay? So you want to make sure you have good documentation as to why you're making decisions to bring certain people back. Focus on skills, you know, the job duties, the dependability, these kind of objectionable, verifiable facts that you can have in personnel files as part of your business planning that will help you, you know, deal with the issue if, when we come out of this, there's some kind of a claim filed. I think the more thought you put into these things, the more detailed it is, the easier it is to explain to the employees, and the more digestible it is for them. So, and that's just, you know, my thoughts and my experience from providing this type of advice for almost 20 years now. Hard to believe.
Frank, thank you so much. It's 11 o'clock, so we promise our folks that we bless and release them at this point in time in our presentation. Thank you. Really huge topic, lots of things to talk about. I will save the presentation along with the recording. So folks that wanted to see the slides that we didn't get to have an opportunity to see those as well. And certainly as we navigate this, once we start the rolling openings, would love to have you back and have you answer more questions as we sort of get a sense of what the future is going to be.
Well, you're very welcome. I hope this was informative and valuable to the participants. And I'm sure as everybody's learned from listening to me today, I do love to talk, and I'd love to talk to everybody in the future. But sincerely, if I do come back in the future, I welcome questions, and I love an interactive process with the audience. I just want to be as helpful to people as I can. So thanks so much for the opportunity, and thanks everybody for their time. It's appreciated.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And so just as a reminder, tomorrow's program, the Small Business Solutions Series workshop will be WTF, what's the future? And it will be a roundtable discussion. Just anybody can chime in, have candid conversations. I hope you can join us. If you haven't registered, be sure to do so, and have a great rest of your day.